my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Katie McKenna, and her topic is, I feel like I've been run over by a truck. How to heal, communicate with, and inspire resilience in your patients after trauma. Katie's a professional speaker, life coach, and best-selling author living in Brooklyn. She's the author of the book, How to Get Run Over by a Truck, and runs the blog Small Bites and Little Victories. Katie's work has been featured in Health Magazine, Brooklyn Magazine, Reader's Digest, Chicken Soup for the Soul, and the Daily Mail, as well as many other publications. Katie's spoken at Fortune 500 companies, hospitals, medical schools, universities across the country. She has no financial relationships relevant to this activity. So I'm going to take a breath and tell you that when our team got together and made the recommendation for Katie to be a keynote speaker based on the book, I said, well, let's read the book, right? So Mary, where's Mary? She's still up front. Mary said, I'll get the book, but I'm going to read it first. She handed it to me and she said, Dr. Carney, you're going to laugh and you're going to cry. I'm talking about you. I said, you're going to laugh and you're going to cry. I said, all right, bring it on. So I read the book, and I can tell you so much came to me personally as a clinician. And I flashed back to what one of our mission leaders said to me many years ago. She said, Dr. Carney, it's intent versus impact. Sometimes we don't realize that our intent is so positive, but our impact isn't. And taking that step back away to realize that maybe there's a different way, or maybe there's some way that I could connect, or I really didn't mean what I just said like that. So I'm going to read you an excerpt out of her book that I thought was so powerful. As we listen to her story, it's amazing, but really what our role as care providers are in helping patients heal. So first of all, I have to tell you that I got rid of all the expletives.
There are a lot.
There's a lot. I felt like I was reading Tina Fey. This part starts after she was taken out of the ICU onto one of the medical floors. She was there what appears to be about a week or so. You already know what I'm going to read, right? I do. So she was there for about a week or so when a social worker's in her room. And what she's relating in this paragraph is how the social worker, went through her checklist, gave her all her resources, yada, 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 check, 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 and then she said she's gone through her checklist. She stood up to say goodbye. She walked about 5 steps towards the door and then turned. You must be so grateful that you're not dead. You must feel so lucky. It was as though she had strapped a metal glove on her hand and slapped me across the face. I was seething with hurt, anger, and disbelief in her insensitivity. My thoughts raced around my immobile body like a tiger in a cage. I cocked my head to the side and I stared at her. Well, you've got me there, champ. I'm the luckiest girl in the world. And yes, I'm so grateful that I'm not dead. You're totally right. Being dead would be awful. But do you know what's worse? Lying here, immobile, watching you walk around any place you desire. This is totally worse than being dead, because if I was dead, I'm pretty sure I would be in heaven. I know this because I'm sort of a sweetheart. I give money to charities, I volunteer, I even work at a homeless shelter. I recycle, I give up my seat for a pregnant woman on the subway. But instead of being dead, hanging out in heaven with all the angels and Jesus, and all the other nice kids who died too young, I'm lying here, unable to move, listening to you explain to me how grateful I should be. Don't you understand that this was not how my life was supposed to be? I was going to grow up strong, funny, and able to stand upright. My life was to be full of innocence, joy, and love, buying flowers in the spring, lying out on the beaches in the summer, sledding in the winter, and walking the streets of New York in the fall. That was what my life was supposed to be like. There was no fighting off death, no blood-spattered sheets, no loss of feeling in my legs in the grand plan that I had for my life. Gratitude is reserved for a different time, a different me. It has no home here now. Okay, I didn't really say any of that, but I'm sure that if I hadn't been heavily sedated, and if I'd drunk all my sassy juice that morning, it totally would have happened. With that, Ms. Katie McKenna.
Chapter 2. Oh my goodness. I'm not sure. Can you all? I'm not sure if if the lavalier this is working here, right? With this guy. Oh, it works. Fabulous. I love lavalier. Isn't that such a fancy name? I'm always like, it makes me feel like a knight. Well, as I was doing this part, well, that was such a beautiful introduction. It's always such a funny thing to hear other people say the words that you've written. You know, it's such an amazing thing of being like, you're a ridiculous writer and kind of a very funny person. I can't tell you how honored and delighted I am to be here with you all today. Seeing everything that you're working on here is nothing short of breathtaking. It is incredible how hard you have worked in order to make this hospital system as wonderful as it is. And I have to tell you that coming here and speaking with you all, the idea that I have something to present to you is kind of amazing, because I go to all medical professionals like begging for information. So me having anything to say to you all makes me feel pretty fancy. So I appreciate that. As I was preparing for today's talk, I researched the history of your hospital and the people who are responsible for its founding, what its mission is, and I was so moved by the mission to serve together in the spirit of the gospel as a compassionate and transforming healing presence within our communities. And I thought about that and just realizing that's who you are as professionals. You're healers. You transform people's lives. You transform them from being sick to well. And what you do is also you're there and you're present during their greatest joys, and you stand with them, unflinching, during their greatest trials. I know about that strength firsthand because I was the beneficiary of that kind of strength at the hands of a different set of medical professionals one sunny morning in October. So the title of my book, as we know, is How to Get Run Over by a Truck. And I'm going to be honest with you, this isn't just an incredibly clever title. I know that I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler. I was run over by an 18-wheel truck, and the spoiler alert is, everything, it turns out, awesome. So don't be worried. But the only reason why my story ended up the way that it did, with me here walking, talking, and with you today, is because of the strength, courage, and professionalism of men and women like you. I was the doctors and nurses who were boots on the ground, who were helping to heal me, the administration who worked tirelessly to make sure that the hospital ran as well as it could, and also the insurance company that provided me the care that I so desperately needed. I cannot express to you how grateful I am to each and every person in this room. I'm sure that you're wondering, okay, so run over by a truck, that's a turn of phrase. That's what I say, after a really hard day of work or a very long weekend with in-laws. How does that actually happen? Well, I was just finishing up a 10-mile bike ride in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where I still live. And I was at a stoplight, and the sun was starting to rise over these low brick buildings. And I thought that the best way to start my day would be to watch the sunrise. And there was a truck on my left-hand side, and he didn't have his indicator on. So I thought I was clear and easy. And the light turned, and I made this wide right turn. And unfortunately, the truck driver just didn't have a signal on. He didn't see me. He just saw a green light, and he turned. I was very lucky in that I missed getting run over by the cab of the truck by a few inches, but it was an 18-wheeler, and I was run over by the first four wheels of the truck. And then sadly, because he didn't know I was there, I was then run over by the second set of four wheels. The accident was the beginning of my journey, and you're seeing me here now at the end of it. And when I spoke with the team here at Mercy, they thought that you all might be interested in the in-between part, the nebulous portion, where I went from being shattered to putting all those pieces back together. And maybe I could share some insights into where your patients are, when they're going through that same sort of a challenge. My trauma experience was incredibly unique, not just because it's something out of a Warner Brothers cartoon, but also because I was conscious during the entire event. up until I was intubated for surgery. This was a benefit because I could speak to the EMTs. I actually remembered my phone number, of my home phone number, to call my parents to tell them that I love them, potentially for the last time. And I told them what hospital I wanted to go to, and I was aware of everything that was happening. On the flip side of that coin, I knew exactly what was happening during this experience, and that experience was something that I relived about 40 times a day. My PTSD was pretty intense, and I tried to figure out a way of taking this experience and making it less present for me, have it be something that's in the past. And my doctors recommended that I started to write. So I began to write about my story. I wrote as soon as I got use of my hands again, I started to type. And I wrote while I was in rehab, and then when I went home, and then as I continued to heal. So I have a really good idea about what's going on in the hearts and minds of your patients as they're going through a trauma experience. When we talked about what might be helpful for me to share today, what might be the best takeaways, would be how your patients adjust to being sick or disabled. What is that adjustment, and what might help or hinder that adjustment? And we also thought it might be helpful for me to highlight how important communication is between yourselves as medical professionals and also between yourselves and patients, and how that can help or hinder your healing. Also, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about resilience, and resilience in your patients, as well as resilience in yourselves as medical professionals. If it's okay with you, I would love to share a portion of my book with you, just so that you have a sense of where I was right before I came under the care of medical professionals like yourselves. Would that be all right? Fantastic, thank you. Just gonna have a little sip of water. I lay there waiting for something to change, something to get better or worse. I waited for a break in the silence that kept ringing in my ears. I remember looking up as the early morning sky went from that dark morning color to a sunlit, pale, pale blue. The clouds looked like they were whipped out of cotton candy. I screamed out for someone to call my mother. If my mom was there, she could fix it. As soon as she was notified, all of this could be undone. Because this was not reality. Reality was that I had a big day at work, and I was nervous about getting really sweaty in my new suit. Reality was not that I was on the precipice of losing my life. That was not what was happening. I refused to close my eyes. As the initial shock of impact began to wear off, my body reacted with crushing pain. It was unlike anything I could have imagined. I was confused by it. I couldn't believe that there would be a sensation that would continue to radiate out of my body. Usually the pain of dropping something on your foot or running into something fades, even just a little. But this pain kept on doing relay races up and down my body. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't shake it off or massage it or even walk to a place where I could alleviate some of the pain. I had no choice but to just lie there and try not to drown in it. I remember a young woman who was about my age came over to me and said she would call my mom. She asked me if I knew the phone number. I did. I remembered it as a song that my mom had taught to my brothers and sister and me to learn all of our numbers. This young woman, the one who was calling my mother, she'd been in the car behind the truck, and now her boyfriend was lighting flares around me, around the accident scene. They were saving me. He put up orange cones, and then everything changed. I watched as this woman took responsibility for calling a perfect stranger's mother to tell her that her daughter's body had just been crushed by an 18-wheeler. I heard her name was Giselle. She sounded scared. Her voice shook as she told my family's answering machine that I had been in an accident and that whoever got this should call her back as soon as possible. I knew then that I was broken. My mom wasn't home. She'd been called and nothing was better. Plus, Giselle was so frightened. She couldn't even feign calm as she left that message. I was stricken with terror, but I couldn't give in to it. I knew that if I let myself fall into it, fall into the fear, the loneliness, the hurt, I would be lost forever. I had no cell phone, no ID, and I had done the one thing that my mother had always told me not to do, which was to not wear underwear, because in case you get into an accident. It's true. And if I got picked up and I died and I couldn't make an explanation, I'd have some serious explaining to do. I knew that I couldn't be a Jane Doe without underpants who rode a bicycle, and I really didn't want to go out like that. My one job was to stay awake. I needed to stay awake. My brain kept whirring as I lay on that Brooklyn street. What do these people need to know? What do I need to say? I can move my toes and fingers. If I pass out, tell the paramedics I'm not paralyzed. That wasn't actually true. And I spoke with the authority of someone who actually knew what they were talking about, not a theater major who could barely put on her own Band-Aid. Please? Can you hold my hand? I asked Giselle. I'm scared. I didn't want to say it. I wanted to be strong and funny and let this just roll off me. I wanted to believe that this wasn't a big deal, that I could have put a Band-Aid on this, all by myself. But after telling another person that I was frightened, it became clear to me that I wasn't tough enough to do this on my own. Was this it? Seriously? Was I gonna die on this Brooklyn street because of a wrong turn on a bicycle? As I held desperately onto the hand of my new best friend, a man in khaki cargo shorts, a plaid short-sleeve shirt, and a New York Yankees hat stepped out of his Toyota Camry and walked towards my spot on the asphalt. With no hesitation, he slipped his rough hand into mine, looked into my eyes, and with a Spanish accent and a confident tone, he said, "Listen to me. I'm a pastor. I've spoken to God, and you're not going to die today." I needed for him to be right. I wanted him to be my prophet. "Do you promise?" I asked. "Yes," he promised. If I could have lifted my hand, I would have made him pinky swear it. He took Giselle's hand and said, "Let us say the Lord's Prayer." And I said the Our Father with my new congregation of 3. I prayed for God to know that I didn't want to die, that I didn't want to go to hell, but I didn't want to go to heaven for that matter either. I just wanted out of this situation. But the fact that my legs weren't working and I didn't have a flux capacitor, like in Back to the Future, to turn back time, I knew I was completely out of luck. So I just made sure that I didn't close my eyes. The one thing that I could control just then was my eyes. They were the only part of my body that wasn't hurting. I kept them open for my mother, for my father, for my brothers, for my sister, for my boyfriend, and for my friends. I knew that if I closed them, I would be giving up on ever seeing those people again. I would never see a little kid with an ice cream cone, or a leaf blowing like a confused butterfly in the wind. If I closed my eyes, I would never see the way that someone looks right after you hug them. If I closed my eyes, there was the possibility that I would be in darkness forever. So I stared, unblinking, into the sunlight, gulping up as much light as I could. Plus, if God was going to take me, I wanted to see him coming. Soon after that, I was picked up by the ambulance and was rushed into emergency surgery, where after about 3 hours, the emergency room doctors came out and they told my parents that I wasn't clotting. I had gone through about 8 pints of blood, and what they said was that after an hour, they were going to stop operating, and they were just going to let me go. I have always been a bit of a procrastinator, so I waited until just about 15 minutes left before my blood started to clot. After that, the doctors worked for another 10 hours to tirelessly put me back together again, and they were able to save me. When I woke up from surgery, my life was unrecognizable to me. I'd been an active 24-year-old, quick to laugh, had a lot of friends, a beautiful job, and I lived in New York City. I felt like the world was my oyster. It's no Philadelphia, but it's okay. I arrived at this second phase of my life with a tear in my bladder, punctured lungs, all of my ribs broken, my pelvis fractured in 5 places, and additional internal injuries. A portion of my side was torn out by the gear shift of my bike, and I had no feeling in my body below my rib cage. Obviously, it was a bit of a switch in about 6 hours. So over the next few weeks in the ICU, I was in really bad shape, and I'm sure that many of you have seen this with your own patients. You're confused about where I was and also how I'd gotten there. And I constantly felt like I was drowning under waves of pain that just felt endless. The morphine pumps and Oxycontin eased the pain, but there was no medication that could ease the terror of knowing that the life that I'd been living just a few days before no longer existed. I was so afraid that I was never going to be normal again. And then that fear came to life when my attending doctor told me that I would never walk again. I was flattened by what my doctor told me. I wasn't sure of who I was if I wasn't an athletic person. I had been either biking 10 miles a day or running 5 miles a day, and I've been playing sports since I was about 5 years old. And being active was a big part of how I defined myself. And now it wasn't even being athletic, it was the ability to be mobile. It was a huge benchmark of my self-worth. I felt like I just lost that thing, that one part of me that made me who I was. And who I was as a person felt totally threatened because I could no longer do basic things like get food for myself or leave a situation that I didn't want to be in or take care of the most basic functions without aid. This accident created a new reality for me. And it was one that I really wasn't sure about how to acknowledge. And have you ever seen that with any of your patients where they're not really sure? Have you seen that before? It's an interesting thing. And the things that I found that were the most helpful when medical professionals were working with me was when you're dealing with a patient who's in an illness space or if they're post-trauma, to listen to them and to be understanding of the fact that their life has just gone through a huge change and that it's going to be different going forward. You all probably know this, but as their medical professionals, you are the closest thing to an oracle that they have. They live and die by what you tell them. And when you pay attention to them and when you sit with them in that space and you listen to them and you're empathetic, it gives them the opportunity to really acknowledge what's happening with them as well. By meeting your patient in that space, you're giving them the chance to move forward and to not get stuck. The second step is to empower them. The biggest challenge that we face with a trauma or an illness is that we feel completely out of control with our own bodies. It's as if the body that we once knew and loved and respected is now not following directions. I remember I'd lay in my bed and look at my legs and be like, you guys, we can move. We've done this before 1,000,000 times. Come on. And for the first time, they're just not paying attention. And for me, personally, it felt like a betrayal. And it made me feel incredibly helpless. There was this wonderful study that I read that is about personalized strategies to activate and empower patients in healthcare and to reduce health disparities. And what it said is that asking empowering questions are considered one of the best ways that you can improve patient health. It's done at a low cost, and it's pretty easy for you to do and just take those minutes to really acknowledge and to ask them these questions about themselves. By sharing decisions about small aspects of their care, what you do is you give them the opportunity to really reconnect with their bodies. And it can be something as small as being like, what do you think might positively impact your care? To be honest with you, if a doctor had asked me that, I wouldn't have had an answer. But once they asked me and I said, if I could get Frosted Flakes for breakfast, that would be a game changer. And the next morning, they brought me Frosted Flakes. And my palpable joy was unbelievable. I couldn't believe how delighted I was by it. I was like, I'm the best girl in the whole hospital. And then it made me feel hopeful and more connected to my medical professionals and also to my care experience. The third thing that you can do for your patient is to acknowledge the idea of failure and talk about what that looks like. For me at first, the idea of failure was not being able to walk again and being non-mobile. And that was my biggest fear. But what happened is that I worked with my doctors and they acknowledged, like, okay, that could be a failure, or we can transform what failure looks like. Instead of thinking of failure as being paralyzed, what if you thought about failure as not trying, as giving up? And that changed the game for me completely, because it allowed for me to believe that I had control over the situation, that as long as I tried every single day, then I had the potential to be successful. The fourth way to assist your patients is to focus on what the name of my blog is, but I think is also a truth, this idea of small bites and little victories. This was the most important component of my recovery. Realizing that the road back to health would not be achieved magically was really helpful. No matter how many times I had seen those Lifetime movies where suddenly they're in the wheelchair and then they just start walking, I realized that that wasn't going to be happening for me. I started to shift my focus from, okay, I can't walk, and being upset about that, but instead focusing on the things that I could control. I thought that if I was going to be paralyzed and have no leg strength, then it would be really important to me to have a really strong upper body. So every day I started to lift little mini weights in my hospital bed, and there was the triangle that was above my hospital bed, and I started to do these little pull-ups, which it was very adorable. But it was helpful because I saw that with hard work and determination, that my body could shift and change in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And it kept me motivated to do my best every single day. The second aspect of that is the idea of celebrating these victories. As a culture, we have a tendency to only allow ourselves to celebrate when there's something really big that happens. You know, when we get the big promotion, when something really big. I knew that I couldn't live my life that way, because if I was still waiting for that day when I started walking, then I'd be disappointed every single day. So I made these really small goals, and it might have just been doing those 3 chin-ups on that triangle, and I would celebrate it like crazy. There was this wonderful staff member, his name was George, and I was like, George, red letter day, 3 pull-ups, can you believe it? And he was like, Katie, it's a really good day. I was like, do you want some orange juice? We can share, it'll be great. I gave myself permission to not only celebrate what my body could do, but also it was great because it let me be grateful that I was capable of doing it. Another big thing that I'd love to talk to you about is communication. So before this accident, I'd only spent a few hours in a hospital before for normal kid stuff, concussions, and a couple of stitches. After my accident, I stayed in a hospital for over 2 months. And they became my entire world for that period of time. And during those 2 months, I went to 2 separate hospitals. And I had very different communication experiences at those hospitals. And I was amazed by the impact that it had on my psychological and also my physical health. The ER and the ICU at the hospital that I stayed at, they were incredible. And I think that's clear from what they were able to do with my broken body. But unfortunately, when I was brought into the general population, I was treated in ways that made it really challenging for me to feel taken care of. And these things range from the very small, to doctors not learning my name, to larger things, like being denied pain medication after 2 separate surgeries, to being told that I wouldn't survive the surgery that I went into to save my life, and also that I would never live a normal life. What these actions did was instill in me a sense that I was not important, and that I also wasn't worthy of adequate care. I had this overwhelming feeling that if I were in trouble, that these were not the people who would be interested in helping me. I didn't trust the people that I needed to trust the most. And that was terrifying. I realize now that the way that I was treated by different medical professionals had absolutely nothing to do with me personally. These men and women were trying to do their jobs. They wanted for me to be well, to live a beautiful, happy, healthy life. It's just that life gets in the way, and your jobs are incredibly challenging. When I was transferred to the next hospital for rehabilitation, I found myself in a very different care situation. This was the Frosted Flakes Hospital. The men and women who cared for me made me feel like I was a person. There were tiny things that they did to help to build rapport between us. Like when my medical team, they learned what name I like to be called. My full name is Catherine, but that always makes me feel like I'm in trouble. Anytime I'm here like, hello, Catherine. I'm like, my hand is in the cookie jar and it's before dinner. When they called me Katie, I felt like they knew me and that they cared about me. Sometimes it was the doctor or nurse making eye contact for just a few seconds, or being asked before I was used as a rare case learning tool for residents. It changed the way that I felt about my care, about the medical staff, and also about the hospital itself. It was incredible. What differentiated the medical professionals who went to the next level were the men and women who talked to me about what my life was outside of the hospital. The idea that I was a person in the world and that I would be again was incredible. It made me feel so hopeful in a way that I hadn't before. Then there was one doctor who, her name was Dr. Belkin, and when she and I spoke, she said to me, I'm really sorry for what happened to you. And when I looked in her eyes, I saw genuine sympathy and empathy. She talked to me like a friend or a family member. And I remember laying in the hospital bed and I wept in gratitude. During my rehabilitation, I saw my mobility and my capability grow in these profound ways. And I exceeded expectations in regards to mobility and in regards to overall health. And I know that was a direct impact of the relationships that I had with the medical staff. I also wanted to share with you what was maybe not as helpful when I was interacting with medical professionals. There's this idea of you can't or you won't. With my specific injuries, it was really difficult for medical professionals to have an idea about what I would be able to do in the future. And I know that it is so important in a lot of instances to give kind of the worst case scenario because you don't want to create false hope. This worst case scenario was given to me a few times. First, as I had mentioned, as I was being rolled into emergency surgery, I asked the doctor who was closest to my head, I said, do you think I'm gonna survive? And she said, probably not. Totally fair assertion. She came within about 15 minutes of that being totally true. There were other instances that were a little bit harder to take. And this was mostly because of the delivery. I'd mentioned this before, but the doctor who told me that I would never walk again. Again, a totally fair assertion, and more than likely, it probably should have been true. Everything pointed to me not walking. What I realize now is that if the information had just been presented to me in a different way, then maybe it would have been more helpful. If he had potentially said, you know, the breaks that have happened within your body and the way that you've been reset, the potential is really low. We've seen other people in your situation also have challenges, but we've seen so far that you're a fighter, and that bodes really well for the idea that you'll be mobile in the future. Being clear about what's happening, as well as making me as a patient feel positive about how I had interacted with them so far, would have given me hope and made me really want to try to be better. The other instance was when a nurse who was doing her rounds said with a laugh, well, at least now you won't have to pay for birth control. Yeah, again, another totally potentially true situation. I'm not married yet, so who knows? Fingers crossed, everybody. But the problem was that she had told it to me apropos of nothing, and it was given to me without asking, and she didn't give me an explanation. She just left the room. So what it did is that it reiterated this feeling that my body was not my own, and that I was not worthy of having the information about what was happening within my own body. It might have been helpful if she said, Katie, no, we don't believe that you're going to be able to have children because your pelvis probably won't be able to support the weight of the baby. But we don't know that for sure. And you won't know until you actually try. And that's something that doesn't need to, nor can be assessed right now. What these two interactions did is make it really challenging for me to feel like I was ever going to get better. Another thing that was challenging was a lack of clarity around care. There is so much that you can't control when you're a patient. Your mobility, your pain, what kind of television your roommate is watching. I was like, all right, Lauren, how many times do we need to watch The Wheel? We all know what it's gonna be. You do the RSTLNE, they're gonna guess it, it'll get there. It was this huge change from what my life was only a few days before. What made this transition even more challenging was that very often I wasn't made aware of what was happening with my care. For example, I was taken out for x-rays and then I was left in a hallway for 7 hours and I wasn't told what I was waiting for, what the x-rays were for, and I wasn't visited by any medical professionals. In another instance, after 2 surgeries, I was denied a morphine pump for 6 hours. At that point, I was on a morphine pump or about 300 milligrams of Oxycontin a day. So I'm sure you can imagine the physical pain as well as the mental challenges that came along with that. This feeling that my life, my health, my needs weren't a priority created a huge sense of distrust between myself and the medical professionals that I was working with. Because I didn't understand the why, I felt like I had no control over the situation. Like I always needed to be on my guard, which I know was absolutely not their intention. And it could have been fixed with just a few words of explanation. I wanted to take a moment to talk to you all about resilience, which honestly feels like a ridiculous thing to talk to medical professionals about, because you are the most resilient group of people I have ever encountered in my life. Nurses and doctors have healed me, they've soothed me, they've laughed with me, they've cried with me, they've been a surrogate family to me. And then I watch them walk out of my hospital room door and do it again for another patient, and then another, and then another. I marveled at their strength, and I marvel at yours today. Resilience is defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, or toughness. I like this definition because it feels broad and wide, like there's no specific way that we are supposed to be recovering from a challenge. It doesn't matter how we've done it, it just matters that we come back. After my attending doctor told me that I would never walk again, I had a pretty serious breakdown. And to be honest, I felt pretty sorry for myself. But luckily for me, I'm a very stubborn Irish woman. And a few days later, I decided to take his diagnosis as a challenge. And I worked tirelessly on regaining my ability to walk. Now, 11 years later, as you can tell, I am walking. I've also challenged myself to do what I like to call a Katie Mac elliptical half marathon, which is just a one-person half marathon. I win it every year. And it is done in the very beautiful basement of the Retro Fitness Gym in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I line up little cups of water and I have a little sticker. But the thing that's amazing is that I surprised myself in that last year I ran 13.1 miles on the elliptical machine, and my average time was 7 minutes and 13 seconds for every mile. And that was definitely better than me in high school, so I felt pretty proud about that. And then, thinking on that, and then also there was another medical professional where right before I left the hospital, and I was going to move in with my parents where they'd set up a makeshift hospital in their home, the doctor thought it was important to tell me that I needed to understand that I would never live a normal life. And I will tell you that I think that he was kind of right, because my life is not normal. My life is extraordinary. I share this with you because there are always going to be people in our lives who tell us that we can't do something, that we aren't capable, or that it's impossible. But in those moments, what those people are doing is that they are underestimating something so important. And that's the power of the human spirit. If I had been a different person, one with less hope, less determination, then maybe I would have leaned into what the doctors told me. I would have never gotten out of that hospital bed or a wheelchair. And I just would have accepted it and said, this is my life now. And I have no power to change it. But instead of giving up, I focused on something that my dad would say to me every night before my mom and dad left the hospital. They worked their way around all the machines that I was hooked up to, and they'd take off my oxygen mask so I could give him a kiss goodnight. And my dad would linger for an extra second, and he'd whisper in my ear, and he'd say, can you do me one favor before I go? Can you make me one promise? Can you keep punching? I know that you are in the fight of your life, and you're getting the tar kicked out of you. But will you keep swinging? You don't have to win, sweet girl. Just don't give up, okay? He reminded me that there was still fight in me, that I'd been weakened, but that there was still a strength that couldn't be touched, that I still had access to, and that with hard work and determination, that strength could grow and multiply as long as I was brave and I didn't give up. I am 100% sure that many of you don't talk about how hard you fought for your patients, how strong you've been, how daring. All of these amazing things that you do, somehow they get forgotten. There are things that you all do as medical professionals, which truly I view as miracles. You think of them as one-off incidents, maybe just a part of the job. Those magical moments when you are the most courageous version of yourselves. You think maybe they're not that big a deal. Well, I'm here to tell you that they are a very big deal. Not just to me, but to every one of your patients. I will tell you from my own personal experience, and I was just sharing this, that on my birthday, when I blow out my candles, I think of my doctors and nurses. On the anniversary of the accident, my family and I, we go to the corner where the accident happened, and we drink champagne, and we toast to the life that I almost lost, and the gratitude that we have for each other, and we raise our glasses to the men and women just like you. There are no words for the level of gratitude I have for all of you in this room. You've taken your skills, your intelligence, your time, and you've devoted it to the care of other people. Because of men and women like you, I'm alive today. And I'm sure that there are some days where you're not thanked for all that you do. And I want to make sure that today is not one of those days. Thank you so much for what you do in service to your fellow human beings. And thank you so much for taking the time to hear my story. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.